Okay, so globalization of what? So let's define the territory. You may, of course, be motivated by other questions, but I'm forcing you to focus on these, mine, for now. What are the markets we're talking about, and what are the things we're not talking about? And it turns out, I think, probably the ones we're not talking about are more important than the ones we are. And the problem is we can measure those better, I think. I won't say a word after this PowerPoint bit coming on about the transfer of disease. And you can think of 3 episodes in history. There are more, but I can think of 3 where they are extremely important. And here are 2 that took place during a period that I'm alleging is anti-global. But policy could not stop the transfer of disease, and their impacts, were just profound. I see now that I just have the 1 in there for the 16th century and the impact of the transfer of diseases to the Americas, which there's a big debate about historians over the magnitudes. Who cares when it's 90 to 95%? That's a big number. And it's so profound because what we now call Latin America and Central Americas get hit with this demographic disaster after the Iberians arrive. When the Iberians arrive, they arrive in an environment which is relatively labor abundant. And by the end of the century, they're in an environment which is labor scarce. And they try to offset this immense change in what an endowment shock, right? Huge. And they try to respond to it first by importing enslaved Africans, but that's pretty small numbers to make up a gap like that. But number 2, and more importantly, they develop institutions which are favor them in terms of extracting rents from these colonies, but are become increasingly anti-growth during the period. And of course, Latin Americans feel they're still suffering over that. So some part of whatever that colonial legacy was, and it apparently is not positive, some part of it was triggered by that demographic disaster. There was another one, of course, the Black Death that hits Europe, which wipes out 50% of the population in an earlier century, the 14th century. So, half? Was there a question? In Europe, 30%? Really? Well, it must be true. Must be true, Mom. Big number. Big number. And if you point to a modern episode, the impact of AIDS in Africa being spread by males, transport workers, and bus drivers and truckers and so on, up and down Africa. The magnitudes may not appear to be quite as big, but Alan Young has written a paper on South Africa, which shows that they're really very big in terms of their impact. Anyway, so we're not going to talk about that, and it may be one of the biggest of the global impacts out there. We're not going to talk about technology transfer, which is a competitor with disease transfer is one of the biggest. You simply just have to focus on, these 2 transfers of technology, which of course are agricultural, because we're talking about agricultural societies, and that's the technology that matters then. The transfer of the potato from the Americas to Europe and Asia, when it reaches China, it's adopted very quickly, and it has an immense impact. It has a Malthusian reaction. It tends to increase population growth rates in China by quite a bit because of this better nutritional source per acre. And then cows and horses to the Americas, great, beautiful. You kill the people with disease, reduce the indigenous population by 95%, then you have all that land. Well, then you import all the horses and cows to graze the land. So that's a nice technological response to that. And these new technologies, these new foodstuffs can have implications to occupations, how people work, and institutional change and all the rest. So they matter. We're not going to talk about that. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about labor markets. I think it's important to recognize that there is no free migration that matters. Only the rich move prior to the 1840s. And we want to know what happens in the 1840s to open the floods for free migration. Prior to that, only enslaved labor, either slaves who were African slaves caught, coerced, forced to move, because now they're capital, and the capital will operate just like any other capital market, and so you can move that capital abroad across the Atlantic, and that capital market will work well. And then there are others, usually whites and usually Europeans, who agree to be enslaved, and so they'll be served time as indentured servants. Those are very well controlled by courts, legal arrangements, and so on. So abuse was relatively minor in that arrangement. The same cannot be said of contract labor in the Indian Ocean involving Indians and Chinese, which is the same idea of indentured servitude. Anyway, that's the only way you can get poor people to move, is to kind of convert them to human capital and move them that way in those times. And then things change in the 1840s, and I want to talk about that and what the impact of that was on labor markets, at least labor markets in the Atlantic economy. That would be the Americas and Europe. So I want to talk about that. So that's one market. Financial capital markets, we have to worry about the economics you bring to a macroeconomy. When I was studying back in the 1960s and teaching you guys, I was using a model that was right for those times but wrong for these times. That is, using models where the economy is closed to international capital and you had to rely on domestic savings. So domestic savings is a very important part of stories in trying to explain accumulation and growth and all that stuff. Well, they're important for the period prior to the 19th century as well, because financial capital markets don't exist, capital flows don't exist, or not much. And so you had to rely on domestic accumulation and domestic savings to finance it. Well, that's going to have to be another day. We have too much to do, so I won't be able to do that, which will disappoint all of you people in the MBAs in the room who want to go out and make a lot of money on working in the financial sector. So I want to talk about the trade and goods market over those two periods. I won't have time to do the rest. 1492 to roughly 1820, and then 1820 to 1913. I'm going to measure the size of the world trade boom after Columbus. Every time I start a project, ever since I was a young man that dealt with economic history, a very learned older person would tell me, you can't do it, there's no data. And they were always wrong, always wrong. Every time they were wrong. There was more data than you could use. Maybe not quite what you wanted, but close. The only limitation is how clever you can be in using it. So we can construct a world trade boom, and I'll show you what you get when you do that. Also, I'm going to try to persuade you that there are a lot of problems for which it's really useful, indeed it may even be better, to not talk about quantities, but to talk about prices. I don't know whether you're familiar with the term, but invert everything into a price duel. So everything you say, you have some economic argument about quantities, supply and demand, and what happens to quantities, and so on and so forth. You can invert, and you can talk about prices. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, you want to do that because even today, there's vastly better data on prices of things than there are on the quantities of things. So it's a good idea to start thinking in those terms, and we're going to do that in terms of the behavior of prices revealing market behavior. I'm going to try to estimate for you the European surplus, that is the income above subsistence in Europe, and its behavior over time. And it's going to be driven by changes in the distribution of income. Distribution of income is going to be driven by what's happening to land-labor ratios in Europe, which is going to favor the landed elite in the system. And that's going to be very critical in influencing the pattern of trade, as you'll see. And then I'm going to use a simple model to decompose the sources of the trade boom. And the answer is going to be interesting because you get the same answer that you do when you look at the experience of the world economy since 1950. You get roughly the same answer when you decompose the sources. So there must be some universal law going on or something. Okay, and then I'll turn to the first global century. Okay, so why has world trade grown? Big thinkers and Nobel laureates like Paul Krugman have opinions, and there's what he says. Basically, he says that journalists don't understand. That's what he says. There is not some irresistible technological force, you know, that's driving the trade boom. Politics matter, and other things matter, and we have to pay attention to them. So an alternative explanation to the evolution of globalization is to focus on political economy and political barriers to the movements of commodities between places. Third, we might just simply focus on unusually fast income growth and what role that's playing in driving the trade booms. So that's what I'm after. I think we're going to find lots of similarities between this episode after 1492 and more recent episodes. Okay, so measuring the trade boom. You grunt and work hard, and you don't want to see all that stuff. What do you want to see the bottom lines? So here they are. That's the growth rate. This is in real terms. That's the growth rate you get. Now again, remember, you're not going to be impressed unless you see a number of 7.5% per annum, or better yet, 11% per annum. I mean, that's serious growth. 1.26. That's not serious, is it? Well, it is compared to everything else. It's a very quiet economic time. And anything that's growing at 1.3% per annum is a big deal. And there it is in the 16th century. Slows down in the 17th, picks up to the same number in the 18th, and then boom. Well, that's the average for the whole period. So it's about 1 percentage point. And then you get into the 19th century, and it increases by a factor of 4, more or less. So it's the difference between that episode, those centuries of 1% a year. That is fast enough, by the way, to still exceed the rate of growth of GDP. GDP, I didn't say GDP per capita, which is almost 0. You know, the rate of growth of GDP growth, just driven mainly by population growth, that number is bigger. So the trade share is increasing in the world economy over the period. But not as fast as that. Second thing you want to notice is that these two numbers for the 19th century, this one, the 385, and then the one for the 20th century, 365, they're roughly the same, which is surprising. Why can they be roughly the same when the rate of growth of GDP in the 19th century was a half or a third of the rate of growth of GDP in the 20th century? And what it's suggesting is, yes, there's a trade boom in both these two centuries, but it was more dramatic in the 19th century.